every 4 years, thousands of poor white voters in the United States who struggle to make ends meet vote for the Republican Party on the basis of claims that Obamacare is stealing your tax money when it disproportionately benefits these poor white people. These people are being misinformed by the representatives whom they trust. They are being forced to make a coerced choice driven by a lack of real information. We want to emancipate these people. We want to give them the information they need to cast a vote in a way that can improve their life. Because the right to vote is only meaningful when the vote is meaningful. Our burden today is to show you, first, that informed consent is necessary for a vote to be legitimate, and second, that our policy creates better policy outcomes. These two are independent. We can win if we prove either. What is our model? First, we will have this test set by a panel which is neutral, which is multi-party, which has NGOs, poor activists, experts. Basically, we'll have all kinds of groups being represented on this panel to set this test. Second, this test will be held once every election cycle so that people can use it in every time there is an election that they need to vote in. Third, the test will focus on 3 essential aspects. First, basic facts about the political system like budget priorities of the current government. Second, on the basic ideological stances of each party. And third, on simplistic policy-based questions, like for example, what is welfare, who is given more welfare. Fourth, providing information in every way possible. We're happy to debate the full spectrum of information. Flyers, free online courses, information spread out through local governments, news panels, everything. If they want to propose any counter solutions, we're happy to go up those as well. Fifth, we'll have a basic minimum pass mark. After that, basically anyone who is able to answer minimum number of questions gets equal voting right and voting power. There will be no weightage of votes. Sixth, we think the test will be fairly easy, and passing it will require bare minimum information, so even people with not much time, like professionals, like people who are poor, can still pass and vote just when they spend maybe 10 minutes a week trying to understand the world around them. Seventh, we're happy to have verbal tests for the illiterate who can't actually have a written test on their side. We think the need for a compulsory test is twofold. First, it gives people an incentive to have information when they vote. It gives them an incentive to follow the news. And second, it ensures that all votes cast in the election are meaningful and informed, not just a certain proportion. What is our principle? I have two arguments for you today. First, on why informed consent is important for voting, and second, why our policy leads to better outcomes than their side. My first argument as to why informed consent is important in voting. This matters because voting is a facilitative right, but yes.
If everyone can pass this test, it's really not that hard. How will anyone have an incentive to follow the news or become politically aware?
The idea is that it's easy for them to pass if they follow the news and become politically aware. It's not very difficult to follow the news or be politically aware. That's not an issue. Voting is a facilitative right. It improves the access you have to other rights, like the right to life, like the right to education. The fact that you can use your vote to influence governments who can set these kinds of policies means that it improves your access to these rights on your own terms. But this access can only be improved if your vote is informed, because you give an informed choice to a government to make policies based on your own mandate. How is this true? First, when information means that you can vote for people who prioritize your rights or your issues, it improves your access to these other rights. Second, because harm can occur as a result of misinformed voting. Politics affects policies. The fact is, many policies affect people. It's analogous to driving tests, for example. We recognize that if you're driving on the road, you have the potential to harm other people. That's why we require you to have some sort of basic capability when you go to drive. Similarly, we think that being capable at the ballot box is a prerequisite to not harming people with your vote. Third, because it fundamentally, why do we vote, right? People want to represent their views. They can't do this if they're misinformed. When you give them information, when you give them a test that incentivizes them to follow the news, they're able to truly represent themselves. They can show their opinion when you give them this kind of agency. So let's tie this back. Informed consent is important in voting. That means a policy that ensures that every voter casts a vote with informed consent is one that benefits our democracy as a whole. It means that it allows for true agency of people and represents their views. And finally, we recognize we already in the status quo have an age limit. The fact is, we recognize that only adults can give informed consent. That's why we have a sort of age limit on voting. It's clearly a recognition that we need informed consent in voting. No. My second argument as to why this policy leads to more informed voting. Let's be clear before we start. Apathetic people who don't care are not going to be affected by this policy on either side of the house. They're the ones who won't take this test, who won't cast a vote. Who we think it does affect are marginal people who care about issues that affect them usually, but may not know enough about the broader system to influence it. That's why that's the kind of people we think are influenced by our policy. What happens on our side? First, we think that bandwagon voting will reduce. The fact is, you won't just cast a vote for someone because everyone around you cast a vote for them and you have absolutely no idea what their platform is or what they support. That's the kind of thing that reduces when you have this policy. Second, you don't have votes cast for arbitrary reasons. Like when you looked at a campaign poster on the way to work, it had a very colorful slogan and effective rhetoric. That's why you cast a vote for that candidate. That reduces on our side because fewer people will cast trivial votes that we think that's beneficial. Yes.
If specific knowledge is a prerequisite to good decision making, then would you only allow people with degrees in political science specifically to be...
No, we don't think specific knowledge is important in voting. We think that a degree of knowledge is important in voting, and not just because it makes you somehow get, it's not for some technocratic reason like better policy, it's to represent yourself and your own views. You don't need a political science degree for that. That's why we think that our policy better benefits these people. Secondly, on the comparative, on their side, when people care but are misinformed, that's when you have worse policy outcomes. Like, for example, people in America who have legitimate concerns about immigration, but instead of taking policies like the Democratic Party's campaign to improve Mexico's economy and thus reduce the stem of illegal immigrants, they're going with Donald Trump's inflammatory rhetoric of build a border wall. Despite the fact that one party has a more effective solution to their problem, another one doesn't. We think the fact that they get more information is likely to emancipate them from this. We see this moreover with Brexit. When people want sovereignty from the European Union, but they don't realize that leaving the European Union, leaving the common market will harm them even more, we think that in that case, they recognize once you give them sort of knowledge test that the reason that they can have more political sovereignty through negotiations with the European Union, through devolution of national political power, and that's the kind of thing they're more likely to support. We recognize that on our side, there may be some people who once they have this test, will continue to vote for Trump or for Brexit because of personal or ideological concerns. We think that when this choice is informed and when it's a personal decision, we will respect that. We think that's a basic principle of democracy that we respect on our side. We think that ultimately the reason it's important to have better policies is because a misinformed voter is chosen as a vulnerable target by subjective parties. They are cajoled into voting for a party that will pass policies that harm and hurt their lives. When your family lives from welfare payment to welfare payment, a bad policy means that your children sleep hungry. It means that the school they go to is underfunded. It means that the hospital you send them to can't give them the care they need because you don't have insurance coverage. That's why it's important to have good policies. That's why it's important to have more incentive, more informed voting. That's why it's important to have people having their views represented. The right to vote is only meaningful when the vote is meaningful. So proud to propose.
Thank you, Karthik, for your speech. Next, I'd like to call Mohasab to present her speech.
everyone ready? I'm a farmer living in an agricultural province of Pakistan. Now, I don't know about the national debt situation of my country, nor do I know about what entering into a free trade agreement will necessarily do for my country. What I do know is that if I vote for any government other than the regional representative, then canal irrigation will be reduced to my farm and I can't feed my children, ladies and gentlemen. Does my lack of information about a holistic analysis of the country's political situation mean that my wishes or my political demands or concerns are any less legitimate? Does it mean that I'm any less rational about the analysis of how any political party, if I vote for them, will affect my individual situation, ladies and gentlemen? No, I'm not. And that's the line this side opposition is taking today. Now, before we move on to our main substantives, we'd like to talk about a few things. First of all, I'd like to point out that when they tell you that we won't have something like a technocratic government, they're being disingenuous, right? Because the logical conclusion of their argument is that knowledge leads to more rationality, which is why we would have the most informed people making the most decisions. So when you give people with technocratic degrees more votes, ladies and gentlemen, we think that's a bad logical conclusion to have, and we wouldn't go down that slippery slope. In addition to that, let's talk about the kind of policy and the test they describe for us. Budget priorities, the ideological camp of all political parties, and there's many of them, by the way, dozens upon dozens. And then things like welfare, who welfare goes to and where it comes from, what the taxation system is. Okay, tell me how exactly a poor person who's breaking his back day and night trying to feed his kids on his farm is going to learn about all of these things, considering he probably never had education and doesn't know about the foundations of these issues in the first place. I'm going to tell you you can't, ladies and gentlemen. And that breaks down the first premise, that it's easy. It's really not. And secondly, the second premise that they had was that this is necessary. Is it really necessary? We tell you it's not, right? Because once again, we've told you that positionality leads to rationality, not necessarily a holistic understanding of everyone's situation. In addition to that, the additional premise about how you have the potential to harm other people through the vote, where you vote. I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that's not true at all, right? The driving analogy is false. And this is why. Because everyone in your country votes in self-interest, and the voting and the democratic process is one of aggregate self-interest. If everyone votes in self-interest, you have a numerical, accurate representation of what's best for as many people as possible, ladies and gentlemen. In addition to that, we think they still won't stop people voting in self-interest, because just because you're well-informed doesn't mean that you'll suddenly care about someone living in a province 100 kilometers away. That's false. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, this issue of how they say that they're going to put information out there and people are going to learn it because they care about the political system and they want to vote. So here's the thing, right? If I care enough as a poor person to go to all the lengths of trying to educate myself in order to pass a test because I really care about the way I vote, then why wouldn't I do it anyway, and why do they need their policy? Like they said themselves, their policy doesn't affect people who don't really care about voting, apathetic voters. How are they doing away with that? I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that in the context of the voters that they've identified, their policy simply does nothing. In addition to that, the idea of arbitrary voting and how we're decreasing that. Do you really stop it? Because if I was going to vote due to the flashy colors on a manifesto, then I just won't seek information. I don't care about the test. I won't go out and vote. In addition to that, let's say I pass the test. What's to stop me from voting along arbitrary lines anyway, ladies and gentlemen? So for all of these reasons, their case doesn't exist. Now let's talk about ours. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about how voters have the right to unlimited franchise. Secondly, how politics and policy will disenfranchise certain stratas of society. And then my second speaker is going to talk to you about how their policy allows the government to influence and limit discourse in a way that is detrimental to the rest of society. But before I move on to my main substantives, yes?
Do you support minors not being allowed to vote?
Yes, I do, and I've just broken the link between knowledge and rationality. If you're under the age of 18, or if you're an 8-year-old, for example, clearly you aren't rational, right? Don't make those type of analogies, they're bad. So the first argument, ladies and gentlemen, why voters have the right to unlimited franchise. We say that a fundamental premise of democracy is maximum unlimited participation. Why? We say that a state, as an analogy of this, we tell you that a state has less legitimacy, is considered to be less legitimate generally, if there's a smaller turnout, and because less people participated in this democracy. Now, the end point of this isn't that less people participated in the democracy, which is why the democracy is less legitimate. The end point is that this lack of participation is a symptom of barriers to entry into the political system, ladies and gentlemen, such as polling stations being placed in inconvenient locations, or, for example, certain sections of society not being engaged sufficiently by political parties. I'm going to tell you that, in essence, barriers to democracy decrease the legitimacy of the government in principle. Now the idea is, ladies and gentlemen, that their policy places one additional barrier. Regardless of whether or not it actually decreases voter turnout, we have a moral problem with them putting a barrier in place rather than making it easier for people to participate. Right, now let's talk about this premise of unlimited participation that I talked about. Why does it exist? Because we tell you that the mandate to pass policy comes from the idea that your population aggregated their wishes and concerns, and you have a moral mandate to pass policy affecting them because they voted for you and they consented to it. Now let's talk about this aggregation. We tell you that we say that every singular input to this aggregation has huge value. Why? Because we accept that people have a unique positionality of their own situation, an understanding and a sympathy that no outside observer can ever hope to replicate, right? And because of this, individual positionality and individual input is perhaps the most valid form of political input. Now, what does this positionality mean? It means that people are invested and informed about issues that are relevant to them, and these issues are often not enough to pass a general, holistic, national level test, right? We say, for example, issue-based voting. I've already talked about the farmer and canal irrigation. Or, for example, character-based voting, where, for example, the state has been monopolized by dynasty politicians, and you want to vote for a new leader who started out small in your constituency, and you trust him, which is why you want to elect him into the National Assembly as well, ladies and gentlemen. We say that you don't need to know about the balance of payments of the country, and nor should you. In fact, your demands aren't any less legitimate. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, you shouldn't even care, right? And I've already told you about how voting on self-interest leads to the best possible practical democratic impact. In addition to that, gives the government the moral legitimacy to rule. The end point for all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that for all of these reasons, we say that democracy is premised upon having minimum barriers, right? And they are morally corrupt for placing an arbitrary barrier on people entering democracy and participating in it. And let's talk about the second argument now. Sit down, sir. Which is how policies and politics will disenfranchise certain strata of society. Now, the general lens through which I want all of you to view this argument is that the fewer the number of people voting, the less of a moral mandate the state has. Because the mandate to pass policy, once again, affecting people or sections of society is dependent on whether these people consented through their vote to allow you to make decisions affecting you. Now I'm going to prove why there's going to be less people voting, which proves our moral mandate. In addition to that, proves certain practical harms. So why will fewer people vote? We say that poor people will be especially disenfranchised. Why is that? I bring to you the example of how, when statistically proven, by the way, when polling stations are placed further away from poor regions, voter turnout decreases. And that's because poor people are too concerned with making their day-to-day ends meet to go to an inconvenient location and pay for the transport to go and vote. I'm going to tell you that a poor person similarly cannot afford to spend time reading newspapers and books. They're less educated. These concepts like debt and holistic economic policy, like for example monetary policy, are much harder to grasp. Many of them are illiterate as well, right? In addition to that, they can't spend money on books and education either. We say that again, once again, I'm reminding you, less knowledge doesn't mean less rationality, don't misconstrue it that way. So I'm going to tell you that voters, especially poor ones, will increasingly fail the test or will be disenfranchised from going out, learning about the test, and trying to vote anyway. As a result of that, poor people are pushed away from the political system. What does this do? Now, political parties know that poor people will not be able to vote in a system, that they're not a viable voter base, they have less incentive to engage with them and to cater to them. And if only rich people are voting, and by the way, rich people have a divergence of interest with the poor on things like taxation and welfare policy, we think the poor are going to be underrepresented in policy of the government. So for all of these reasons, let the motion fall.
Thank you, Muhasab, for your speech. It is now my pleasure to call up Heman to give his speech.
Let's start by looking at this debate through their filter, and then let's see how through their filter they still lose this debate. We asked them in a POI, we engaged with them on the idea that minors are not allowed to vote, they are not given agency to politically represent themselves because they are unaware. The only response they had to say to this was that knowledge was not equal to rationality. At the point at which they failed to understand the distinction between technical knowledge and basic information about the impacts of policies on your life, about how your life is being changed by the political system, we think they failed to acknowledge a large part of our case. We tell you that a choice is only rational, therefore under their calculus, if you are aware of the impact of that choice, if you are aware of the alternatives that exist, and therefore by their arbitrary rationality, their choice isn't rational. Before moving on to constructives, a few areas of rebuttal. Sit down. First thing, and the only thing they actually spent time analyzing, was single issue voting. So let's comprehensively take this down. The first thing I have to say is that at best, this point is pedantic. But if this is indeed a problem with the kind of way this is happening, we think we're happy to set a number of questions that each individual has to answer, and apart from the basic set of questions that we already established, allow them to pick certain issues on the basis of which they can answer the questions. But second, we think the reason individuals still need to have a basic holistic approach in the kind of voting they have is because it is a lie that a holistic approach doesn't affect you. Just because you're a poor farmer, it's not that only farm subsidies affect you. The education policy affects what kind of education your children get. What kind of war your country goes through affects you, because when the US goes to war in Iraq, it is the poor of the US that are going to lose their lives in Iraq. Therefore, all the structural policies have a trickle-down impact on your life and often a direct impact on the life of your family, for example. That is to say that as a poor farmer, we recognize that you shouldn't just be voting on farm subsidies, but should also consider what kind of education, what kind of welfare the state is providing you, and therefore this argument still stands. But third, they're talking about single interest and self-interest. It is a lie that it falls on our side, because we are the ones protecting self-interest by legitimizing consent. How does this happen? Because oftentimes what they mean by the single issue is an issue that they vote based on rhetoric. That is to say that as a poor US voter, as a white voter, when you vote for the Republican Party, assuming that the Democratic Party affects your lives without actually analyzing the policy distinctions, you're making a vote based on rhetoric, and therefore we are the ones protecting self-interest when we actually inform you that this is what the impact of the Republican policies are going to be. But finally they tell you, no, people should be able to vote based on whom they trust or whom they like. Yes, but what we change is that one, we significantly change the amount of the population that is voting for policies that affect them. But second, even assuming that we don't, in our worst case, people are legitimately voting for Trump because they are not voting on the basis of the lies of the policies they give you, but voting on the basis of some other trust-based issues. Therefore, it is not actual trust until they know what lies politicians are making. The next part of this, let's quickly then deal with the logistical attacks they had on our model. First, they tell you that the poor people don't understand the information. We already told you that the distinction here is that you're aware of the impact of policies of the state on your life. But second, they told you that the poor can't spend on education. We think it is a lie that you need to be technically aware to be able to take this test. Basic policies like how welfare affects you is often simple, common knowledge. What it rather takes is for you to come forward and try to access this information. And also because of the fact that we already told you in our policy that we're happy to provide free books, free syllabi, online courses, TV shows, for example. We think we're creating pervasive spread of information. But the last thing that they did that was a death blow to their own case was when they failed to engage with our two arguments. In our first argument, we told you how we legitimize consent by making it informed consent, and they didn't have any responses to this apart from the ones that I've already taken down. They never engaged with us principally, rather they just had some mechanistic attacks on this information. But second, we told you how better policies are voted in. The only response they had to this was that the poor are not represented on our system. So let's move on to my constructive, and under this I will show you how structurally the poor are benefited by our policy, but before that POI.
If you believe that the more informed a vote, the more consensual or legitimate it is, would you give people who score higher on this test more votes and political representation?
The difference there is that we don't want to discriminate on the basis of whether you have technical knowledge, but rather want to discriminate on the basis of whether you have a bare minimum. That is to say that for legitimate consent to arise, you should know what the impact of the policies are, but don't need to know everything about every policy, but need to know a significant amount of information such that it affects your life positively. What is my constructive argument today? We create a political system more representative of the poor's interests. The shortcomings in the spread of information on their side of the house is that I'm going to be showing you the shortcomings of the information on their side of the house and show you how we change this by introducing the poor as swing voters. So legitimate discourse, that is logical discourse that happens in the status quo on media shows, for example, is been entrenched by the elite. That is to say that all panelists, for example, are macroeconomists or some other form of elite technocrats who fail to recognize or are detached from the sufferings of the poor. Therefore, any logical debate that happens in their side of the house is about the issues that affect the affluent. That is, so when CNN discusses foreign policy or macroeconomics, but fails to discuss things like the poor people's rights. But we argue that even in the case where poor people's rights are discussed, for example, single-payer healthcare systems, we think the debate even then is concentrated about the macro perspectives, where the only discourse is about where the tax money is going and who is being taxed, rather than how it significantly improves the poor's quality of life. The only discussion or the only information that the poor therefore have in their system is the rhetoric that politicians give them. How do we change this? We think when the comparative you have to consider here is that on their side, politicians look at the poor as vulnerable targets that they can sway as using rhetoric. How do we change this? Well, a new set of voters are now mandated to acquire information and are provided with the information. And because people want to vote, like we set up in your first speech, they are forced to learn these in forms of information. They realize the facts. Therefore, the bias that exists in these voters reduces and we create swing voters. This is beneficial in three ways. One, politicians now have to discuss issues. That is, there is a new set of people with new emancipating information. Poor people now have kinds of information that they never have and are structurally denied access to on their side of the house because we're the only ones providing this for them and the only ones mandating them to learn this information. As a result of this, politicians now have to show why, given this new information, they're still a better political party. But second, politicians also realize that the poor now, for example, know what welfare is. Therefore, parties have to engage with these poor voters and are now forced to enter pro-poor policies, for example. Therefore, when a poor voter is empowered with questions as to how a politician claims to represent them but doesn't provide any beneficial policies for them, the political parties are now forced to engage with them in terms of policies. But thirdly, poor political parties also gain the limelight when the poor people now are aware of what issues affect them and how these issues affect them, and only in our house are they mandated to know this information. This is direct clashing with their first and second arguments in their first speech. So we argue that even if on some level turnout reduces, we still get on net utility, better policies and better representation for the poor, and that's why we absolutely clinch this debate. Very proud to produce.
Thank you, Hemant, for the speech. Now, please welcome the second speaker of Team Opposition,
Let's be honest. We're very confused at Team Opposition about what Team Proposition policy exactly means or it entails. Because on the one hand, Proposition Endpoint is helping Republican voters understand and empathize with the intricacies of Obamacare and Republican legislation with regards to taxation. And on the other, they say it's just basic things that people can understand. On the one hand, we'd assume the logical extension of their policy is for more informed voters by virtue of being, by their own logic, more consenting and having more legitimate consent to have a greater vote. And on the other hand, they're saying, no, they're too technical for our liking. Let's just leave them out. We wouldn't discriminate, that's the key word, on their part, between voters who are informed and voters who don't. That discrimination is exactly what Team Proposition is achieving through a policy. We are saying you, as a voter, are less legitimate. Your views are less legitimate than anyone else's just because you don't know more. And yes, we think that knowledge is specific and is not intrinsic to democracy as a whole. But more importantly, and here's one important question before I move into my issues. This answer that a baseline requirement or a basic test, why is that a good enough answer? Why does the government get to arbitrarily decide who is good enough or technically qualified enough for this policy if they're not taking their principle to its own logical extension and shying away from the burden they've pointed out to you from the very beginning? So it's really hard to refute a proposition that has absolutely no idea about its endpoint. Two main issues of today's debate. Is Team Proposition creating the informed consent that they support, that they're talking about, and does it create better outcomes for impoverished people and people from underprivileged communities? Firstly, let's understand whether Team Proposition's idea of consent in this first issue, are they creating consent? Let's understand whether their conception of consent and its link to democracy is really legitimate. On Proposition, we had this understanding that, you know what, and this was an analogy that they really liked, that you, if you're a voter that's underage, don't get to vote because you don't have informed consent. The problem is there are two words in the phrase informed consent, informed and consent. The problem with underage voters is they're not able to consent to voting or consent to making a decision independent of their parents. It's not that they're uninformed. I knew a lot while I was 16 and I'm really proud of that. The simple fact is that they're not able to make that decision independently of their parents and of their household. So that is completely disanalogized. We argued in our model that information is not necessary for you to have a right as an individual to vote. We argue the vote is intrinsic to your views, and regardless of what you know or not, you have a right to express your opinion. The limitation of that expression is completely illegitimate and problematic. Yes, sir?
Do contracts still need information as a criteria for validity in your 7 years?
They just require consent, and in that specific situation, we think it's perfectly legitimate, and A, that's not a vote, and it's not something as intrinsic as a vote. We think the vote is just maybe a little less averse to being pushed out or being illegitimized just because you don't know about Obamacare and all this foreign policy, completely irrelevant. But this last idea, and here's what's very important to understand. Proposition concedes that you do not need specific knowledge to be able to vote. That was first Proposition's answer to a POI. But then why, if their criteria, we were to assume their endpoint was to fix Obamacare or understand the problems in society, how is then that not specific? How is understanding whether your legislature is bicameral or not, or the fact that there are certain political issues going on or not, how is that not specific to a specific kind of understanding of politics? We don't think having an understanding of politics at large is absolutely necessary, first opposition argument, for you to vote or be able to vote. But the more important issue, are they really creating that kind of consent? And here, let me make it very clear. Team Opposition have also been very wishy-washy with the kinds of things that they've been saying. Because first opposition conceded, we're not doing away with apathetic voters, we are not doing away with ideological voters. We're just dealing with the marginal voters. We really don't know who these marginal voters are and how under their policy they'll be somehow influenced to start voting more and making informed decisions. Because if they are, then how exactly, what is the incentive for them not to do it now? We think they're in contact with their representatives in parliament. We think they understand the issues around them to some degree or the other. They don't need to be provided a pamphlet to understand issues. Their life experiences allow them to do that. The fact that they've interacted with government institutions, the fact that they've been voting in the past is interaction and knowledge enough. You don't need it written down on a piece of paper. Yes, sir?
Should self-interest be based on lies or should it be based on facts?
Sir, self-interest can be based on whatever you want. That's the fundamental principle of democracy. That is what defines self-interest. The idea that people are sovereign, and even if and that these institutions are not. But at the end of this issue, let's make it very clear. Even if we concede that worse policies are passed, we argue democracy is not about promoting the best outcomes. It's about preventing the worst from happening. And we think for the worst from their model is a lot of people being absolutely disenfranchised from the political system, which conveniently segues me on to the second issue. Are they helping or harming the impoverished? Let me make it very clear. Our analysis on how they're disenfranchising poor voters was not as much analysis on information and all of that. It was that poor people are the ones that often have to work 6 hours a day, have to take care of large families, are so busy that this added burden, this added requirement of having to vote disincentivizes them from voting. First opposition example on how when voting booths are placed further from poorer districts, these people find it less easy to vote because they're already so pressured by the socioeconomic circumstance that they're in that prevents them from doing this. Second proposition's argument was, well, you know what, we're improving rhetoric and we're improving the outcomes that we're talking about because people will start, the political parties will cater to people more. But why will political parties cater to these poor people more if they're not coming out on voter day, if they're significantly underrepresented and are not being able to vote? This proposition is creating a significant disincentive for them. At best, all of their arguments on outcome are also hung on representation. This better outcome can only exist when people come out on the voting booth to after they've been inspired, according to team proposition, to make very well-considered votes. Broadly speaking, team proposition's entire case is not as much an argument for restricting votes on the basis of knowledge, but just promoting knowledge generally so we can have better votes and better representation. Why don't they just have them? Having dealt with most of their case, let's move on to the remainder of our arguments for you today. I'll discuss how prop policy allows the government to influence and limit discourse in a way that is detrimental to society at large. Firstly, let's understand the effects that proposition policy will have. Now, we recognize proposition said that, NGOs and all these other organizations will collectively come and decide the issues that will go into these tests. But it's very simple. Even if they collectively decide, there will be a certain restriction and limitation on the issues that end up going into this test and people end up voting on. We think there is a restriction and limitation on discourse that will inevitably happen. And we think these issues, this discourse, will be decided by a party that is not legitimate, even if it's the most perfect NGO in the world. Because we don't believe that discourse can be limited on specific issues, like Brexit, etc., etc. Broadly speaking, if this policy were to be implemented in the United States tomorrow, there's no reason, and there's a very high likelihood, the government might not even want to include things like the Flint water crisis in their test, because there's a serious disincentive for the government to bring or promote that kind of discourse when it affects negatively their image. But why is this harmful? Firstly, principally speaking, we don't think it's justified for discourse to be limited to such a large degree. And let me make this clear. We're not saying we're for promoting certain ideas or promoting public awareness campaigns in society. We're saying that kind of a promotion should not be contingent on something as fundamental a requirement or something as fundamental as the right to vote. What we're saying effectively is proposition is strong-arming society into thinking about specific issues or thinking about specific topics where they otherwise might not have. We think that kind of a limitation of discourse is problematic. But more broadly, we think the government might have an incentive to consolidate its own power by limiting specific issues that reflect on it more badly. We don't think that is going to lead to progressive change or fruitful change when the government is able to decide and limit discourse. What have I proved to you? I've proved to you that propositions have been very unclear on what they're aiming to achieve and the positive benefits that they have. And then on the opposition side, we believe in the right to vote, and that right to vote is based on individual autonomy and positionality. For those reasons, vote Team Pakistan.
I'd like to ask the judges if it's fine if I go to the washroom.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the speech, Brett. And now I'd like to call Dhananjay to present his speech.
Your time.
We have a major problem with Team Pakistan's case. Our major problem is that in their case, they bring in only mechanistic and small logistical problems which they could claim on their side. Our main problem really is that they ended up conceding the principle which we ran with in our first argument. The thing that is the most important part of this debate. The principle that your right to vote is only valid to the extent to which that vote is meaningful. Only it's valid to the extent to which that vote is truly representative of whether or not you truly would be benefited by that. And we tell you, we've continuously told you that unless you know how powerful that vote is, unless you know what exactly you're voting for, and unless you know how it affects your life, we tell you that right to vote is not truly representative of what your opinion would have been. Single issue voter, broad-based voter, whatever issue they might put at us, that does not invalidate our core principle in this entire debate. Our core principle is that information and knowledge on how the world or how your country around you is essential for you to make a logical decision, a logical informed decision, not technical knowledge but basic knowledge. So what are the main questions we need to ask in today's debate? But before that, let's look at some direct rebuttal to the previous speaker. He told us that this is going to be used as a mechanism for states suppressing certain ideas. But we told you in our model that we're not going to let that happen. We told you we're going to keep an extremely representative panel with a lot of ideas punched up in there. They even acknowledged this in their speech. And they tried to come up here and invalidate this by saying that no, there's always going to be a bunch of coercion, there's always going to be a bunch of ideas which are being suppressed, but never told you why. We have given you sufficient reasons in our model for you to believe, sit down sir, for you to believe that there is not going to be this violation by the government. We told you the government is not going to be the one and sole only factor in this. They have not responded to this particular nuance. They cannot pretend that they have in next speeches. No, thank you, sir. They need to tell you exactly why it is possible for these governments to manipulate this information. Until they do that, their entire second speaker argument is irrelevant as of now. So let's look at the main questions in today's debate. Firstly, what we told you. We told you that the right to vote exists only to the extent to which you have the right to informed vote. You have the right to informed consent on these topics. What did they try to muddy up this debate with? They told you single issue voters. They have information on particular single issues and so they should be able to vote. We tell you that that's not really part of this debate. That's extremely irrelevant on their side of the house because there's no structural reason as to why single issue voters can't also be part of this test. We gave you a possible solution in our second speaker. And the thing is that this is where we show how they're being extremely mechanistic in their rebuttals. They do not rebut our idea that an informed choice is required, but rather rebut our idea as to whether or not the specific voters can be shown to have informed choice. We tell you that's false. We gave you a possible solution in our second speaker and they did not rebut that. And as a result, we've shown you that single issue voters can be co-opted into our model. They will be represented. They will be allowed to vote. And as a result, that falls out of this debate completely flat. Now, they told you the logical extension of our policy is technocracy. That's false. We never came here and told you that we want people to be informed because it leads to better policies for the country. Rather, we told you that we want people to be informed because only then do they truly have a choice. Only then does democracy actually validate itself, when they can truly make a vote, when they actually know that that is the choice they would have taken. And they've contradicted this entire principle and in two POIs. Firstly, they told you that consent in itself isn't enough. And secondly, on a POI, when we asked them about contracts and about information and whether or not self-interest can be based on lies, here is where they lose the debate. No, thank you. They tell you it can be based on whatever they want. So they're telling you it's absolutely legitimate for a poor farmer to be brainwashed by lies all around him, and that then it's in his self-interest to vote for a particular political party. That POI answer revealed the entire flaw in their entire case. Basically, that information does not exist really on their side of the house, and that lack of information, that lies, is what is shaping self-interest. That is the critical death blow they dealt to their case when they answered their POI in that particular way, and their entire case falls on that principle alone, that information doesn't exist. No, thank you, sir. And this, furthermore, they tried to back this up in saying, we don't see a problem in the status quo. But that's not really true. When Nigel Farage in Brexit can lie to his people about numbers, about the amount of money that will be transacted if a particular policy or if a particular Brexit would happen, we tell you that is a problem, that the people don't have access to information to which they can truly make a choice. We tell you it is a problem if Indonesian farmers are lied to about the amount to which welfare has been effective in their community. That is a lie which we do not tolerate at any point of time. That is a problem. Their main fundamental problem is that they gave us no counter solution to the problem of uninformed voting, and we've shown you how uninformed voting is extremely problematic. Yes, sir.
So if you're talking about people who actually have political will and want to vote in the correct way, but your problems are that they've been misled or have dearth of information, then why isn't just releasing your pamphlets enough? Why is a test necessary?
Thank you, sir. First, we'll show you. Firstly, the fact that you think right now releasing pamphlets is okay means you yourself have rebutted your entire second speaker's argument on why this information is going to be biased. You cannot tell us that you support releasing information while contradicting the information or contradicting the idea of information in itself. So right now, in that POI, you rebutted your second speaker's entire analysis. But furthermore, before I answer that POI, sit down. Let's look at what exactly our core principle has been. Voting can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to you as an individual if you do not know who exactly you're voting for, if you do not know the truth behind the issues you're voting for, specific issues or general broad-based issues. That was our policy. They have given you no intrinsic reason why our policy doesn't cover this, and therefore we win this debate. Now on to a specific debate on which side actually achieves better voting. Here's where we see a bunch of mechanistic problems and a direct response to their POI, which they stated that people if they actually care, are going to go for this information. But we told you no. We told you in our very first speaker that it's essential that this voting is made mandatory. It legitimizes the state release of information. That's extremely essential because when the state releases this information and says that it's important, only then, and says that it's mandatory that you take it, only then are people more likely to take this information. That's a simple reason we gave you from first speaker. They have not rebutted that. Right, and we told, firstly they tried to muddy up this debate by telling you that we can never ensure access. They gave you mechanistic reasons like poor people don't have time, they're illiterate, and they can't spend money. And the thing is that we've given you more or less solutions for that. We've given you on our model, we'll make it completely free for them to access this information. We can broadcast it on the radios and give it to them. These are all, take in note panel, mechanistic problems to providing access to information. They do not rebut the idea that poor people can ever access this information. And lastly, the most important question in this debate, what does this information look like? What is the purpose of this information? The purpose of this very information is to ensure a basic minimum line, to make sure people cannot be abused by lies and mixed around by rhetoric to violate their own right to vote. It's not about technocracy or technical knowledge. We're not going to ask people exact numbers on Obamacare, but rather we're going to make sure whether they know or whether or not they know that Obamacare has in large been effective. There's no reason why you can't know how exactly microfinance might help your life while making you go out for economics degree. We believe that the line on where we draw how exactly effective and how basic this information will be obviously will be arbitrary. There's no benefit on their side coming out and telling you that it's basically there. The basic principle is that if we get together and decide on a line past which that people will be informed voters, can actually secure their rights with a true vote, that's when we win this debate. Because we've shown you that it's possible. We've shown you that principle is important. They've only tried to muddy this debate with mechanistic problems. We've proved to you that the right to vote is only meaningful when the vote itself is meaningful.
Thank you, Dhananjay, for your speech. It is now my pleasure to call Anna for her speech.
Let's take a step back and actually analyze Proposition's case and understand what it actually means. The Proposition has made a very good case for releasing information to voters and making sure that they're educated. What they haven't done is made a case for the exclusion that the motion is proposing. The exclusion of voters based on knowledge. We agree, voters need to get more information. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. More information can never be bad. What we on side opposition do not agree with is the systematic exclusion of certain people from the voter base of their right, their fundamental democratic right to express their opinion, express their vote, which they're entitled to by virtue of being a human being within a democratic society. And that is why we believe India can never win this debate. They say that releasing information and supporting that should be in tension with our case because our second opposition case was about how information can be manipulated. What we believe that they've done is that they've straw-manned a lot of our arguments. What we said in second opposition case was that when the government and any neutral body, any third party body is allowed to decide your votes and whether or not you can exercise the right to vote, that can be abused to exclude certain people from voting. But obviously if you're being given information, at least you're not being stopped from voting within our model. So it's not really any oppression that we're proposing. Releasing information is completely in line with our case and we completely support that. What we do not support is excluding people from their fundamental right to vote. Something that then their third proposition speaker actually dropped. He said that we're not really talking about better choices or better decisions, we're just talking about increased choice. We don't really now know what India really stands for. Are they talking about more autonomy and more choice, which is in tension with their case because they're reducing the number of choices that people have by excluding them from voting, or are they talking about better decision? We believe the first two speakers in most of their case was in fact about proving that they're leading to better decision making, and that practical outcome is basically what they based their entire case on. They didn't really have a principle. And if I refute this practical outcome of better decision making, the opposition wins this debate, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in my first case. Have a seat, sir. My first issue. Whether or not the proposition is actually achieving its aim of creating informed choice. Firstly, we believe they undermine their own case by two very important points in first proposition and second proposition. They say that we're not really saying that people who vote for Trump based on immigration or rhetoric about it will change their decision. So inherently they've conceded that they're not really changing the very issue that they've recognized. We don't believe it's an issue what people vote on, but if they've recognized people voting for Trump on immigration issues as an issue, as a problem, they've conceded that they're not really doing anything about it. Secondly, they've conceded that they're not doing anything about apathetic voters because they don't really care about that. In fact, when our first opposition speaker tells you that more people within the voter base will be disillusioned and there will be lesser voter turnout within their model because you're increasing the barriers to voting, we saw no response. So in the majority of stakeholders, they don't care about the voter base, they don't care about what happens. The stakeholders they care about are these marginal voters. We asked them in first opposition, we asked them in second opposition, tell us who these marginal voters are, how they think, what kind of people you're talking about. We got no response. We got weird models from their side, we got different tensions within that. I'll talk about that, but before that, let's state for you what the opposition thinks the required knowledge for democracy is. We simply believe that if you're a rational human being capable of consenting, you can cast a vote. Because you can come up with opinions, you can come up with views, you can analyze information around you because you're rational and you're grown up. And that's enough for a democracy, because democracies are about views, and the kind of views you have, no third party can pass a quality judgment what kind of views you have. Given that, and given that understanding of how democracies work, let's analyze the cases that Opp Proposition has put forward for us. We believe their model has been, they've actually been proposing two different models, and we'll first talk about their worst case scenario, in which there's an easy test that they've been talking a lot about. How they, in first proposition, said that, well, there's a very easy test, everybody can pass it. Well, if everybody can pass this test, what are you even changing? Because let's understand this. Firstly, if everybody can pass this test, the information that you're giving on issues will not really change the kind of sentiments that people have, because they'll still think about or prioritize the issues that they have. If third proposition wants a farmer to recognize the systematic problems throughout a country, but that farmer is not really incentivized to do so because this test is easy enough for everyone to pass, what are you essentially changing? Can we please close the window? My papers are going to fly away. But secondly, more importantly, we believe they're not really increasing information. Let's understand that. By failing people once they don't have information, they're not really disseminating information. So if I haven't studied for a test and I failed the test, it's not like I'm going to learn more from that exercise. I'm just going to be excluded from voting altogether. They're not really increasing the kind of information that people have. Within their worst case scenario, we believe they can never win. But let's take them at their best then. This best case scenario of a difficult test that's actually a concept of their case is just clouded by privilege. They believe that poor people who work part-time jobs and alongside 2 jobs a day and have barely enough time to spend with their families will take out 30 or 40 minutes and can afford to take out that time despite free information from the state to study for these technical tests. We don't believe that's really true. We don't believe that anybody other than Team India that's clouded by privilege can ever understand or state that people can understand macroeconomics and broad issues of a democracy within 30 minutes of studying when they're uneducated. Uneducated in countries like Pakistan, where the literacy rate is as high as 40%. What you're basically doing is that you're excluding a socioeconomic class, the poor, within the proposition model, because it's inherently there's an inherent correlation between a lack of knowledge and your poverty within the third world, and that's going to take a bearing. You're excluding the poor from voting, and that's very similar to a poll tax that we believe we principally stand against as modern democracies. That's very similar to excluding people. Furthermore, we also believe that what they're doing is by instituting a neutral body, they're allowing for abuse to happen. Third proposition said that they didn't understand this line of argument of ours, they didn't understand what it meant. We believe that even if you create the most neutral of bodies, certain room for exploitation still exists. Let's take the example of India. If all the political parties within India are to form a part of this body, even despite that, people from Muslim origin are still likely to be discriminated against because they're a minority, and that abuse cannot be allowed. We don't believe that any government or third party can ever have the right to decide or pass a value judgment on what issues people should care about. How do you disagree, sir?
At least now explain why, if I'm hired on the basis of $8 a day and I'm only paid $1 a day, why is that contract still binding?
That isn't binding, sir, because that's less than the minimum wage. I don't know what you're trying to achieve with that. Either way, let's move on to the second question within this debate, a question that they've been particularly weak on, whether or not this policy is morally justified. Let's talk about that. We've had very, very little engagement on this principal point from Team Proposition. All they had to say was that, well, it's justified to limit the right to vote because you allow it to be limited to people who are adults and you don't allow minors to vote. We never said that the right to vote is absolute and that rationality can't be used to limit it. What we said is that knowledge can't be used to limit it, and that fundamental distinction is something that we believe India has refused to understand and has been disingenuous about. We believe it's completely justified for you to vote based on one issue, because even if all issues trickle down to you, essentially if everybody votes in their own self-interest, the aggregate effect will be the entire country's self-interest being voted in. And they recognize that when they shy away from their own logical conclusions, they recognize that knowledge is not a prerequisite. When they say we're not for technocracy, when they say that they won't require parliamentarians to have specific degrees, when they say that they won't give more votes to people who score higher on their tests, they shy away from the logical exclusion of their own principle because they recognize that knowledge does not mean that you have more of a vote or less of a vote. Knowledge does not determine your expression. Knowledge does not determine your rights. By virtue of being a human being, you have the right to vote. Don't exclude anyone based on their economic conditions. On that, vote Pakistan.
for your speech. It is now time for the reply speeches. Let's get going with the reply speech of opposition team, presented by Rebuttal.
In proposition's case, at first proposition, we understood that they are arguing their case on two levels. The principal justification on why democracy needs to be extrinsically linked to informed consent, and the practical outcomes of how it betters government and betters policy making. By third proposition, this second argument was effectively dropped and conceded, because all that proposition was saying was that, okay, we agree that our aim isn't about promoting the best outcomes. Our aim isn't about making people understand what Obamacare exactly is. Our aim isn't about, at the end of the day, making sure that we achieve the best possible government. It's just about creating consent. And which actor did they want to create this consent in? Not the apathetic voter who they concede would be unaffected by something written on a piece of paper. Not the ideologically motivated person who they concede would not be influenced by something written on a piece of paper. Just the marginal voter. And for that marginal voter, from the very beginning, we've had a number of responses to everything that opposition has said. First response: even if the decision they are making is uninformed, does not have consent, the democracy functions on the aggregation of interest. So even if I vote against Brexit, whereas Brexit might not have been the best possible thing to do, other people voted for it. If I voted for it, other people voted against it, right? The basic idea that collectively speaking, we decide which way we want to run as a nation. But more importantly, we talked to you about how that individual still understands the same basic facts that they want to promote. Because if that voter is marginal or even slightly politically involved, he'll still know, generally speaking, how the government functions and how it impacts him or her. But more fundamentally, we told you that the idea of a vote is not dependent on how much information you have. It's dependent on you. You are the one that imbibes the vote with the legitimacy that you give it. Even if you vote for the most outrageous policy in the world, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it is a bad decision, just the fact that you are making the decision, just the fact that you are consenting is enough to give that basis the vote legitimacy. That's different from the age restriction, because their consent does not exist. And in a way, team proposition that concedes that. They concede that at some level, it's us and the decisions we make that give it importance, that give it legitimacy. But even if we were to accept proposition arguments, we told you, they never told us what exactly they want to achieve with their policy, the aims that they're highlighting, the end point that they're looking forward to. Either they want to provide basic facts and information or really good ideas about Obamacare. But the fact is simply this: where they refuted this at third proposition by saying these are mechanistic ideas, one of the thrusts of opposition's case, the idea that an entire sect of voters are being systematically disenfranchised, was refuted with, oh, here's our mechanism. Oh, here's education. Oh, here's literacy. But we told you the problems are more fundamental. We told you, for a poor person who has to take care of their family, who finds it very, very hard to be able to vote because they have a 9-to-5 job, that has other priorities in life because of the socio-economic situation they're in, no matter how much information you provide, at the election day, they're still less likely to come to the voting booth, they're still less likely to come out to vote. And that refutes their argument of better outcomes, even if we were to accept or even ignore the fact that they dropped it. Quite simply because better outcomes are not created in a voting system in which people are excluded. Better outcomes are not created in which you treat people who just don't know about their political system as somehow inhuman, less a part of your democracy, and less of a citizen in your society. Because at the end of the day, that vote that you cast is representative of you, is who you are and who you choose to be. Just because you know more does not mean you necessarily consent to that view or understand that view more. We think that understanding is individual, and states have always recognized that that understanding is based on the wishes of the people. So the simple fact that sovereignty lies with the people, not on a political voting knowledge test, please vote Team Pakistan.
Thank you to Mary for your speech. And now, last but not least, I'd like to call up Karthik to finish this debate and give us Team Proposition's reply speech.
Team Pakistan had a shrinking case when at first speech they said knowledge is unnecessary. And then at second speech they said knowledge is ideologically controlled. And at third speech they said knowledge is good. This slide on knowledge reflects a recognition that it really is important, not just for some technocratic reason that it's needed to make better policies, but that it's needed to represent your own agency, that it's needed to represent your own self-interest. They failed to actually make any distinction on what self-interest meant, on what rationality was, using it as a buzzword and a substitute for argument. They conceded this on the idea of contracts, when they said that contracts should be informed in order to be valid. When we tried to ask them a POI about whether a contract would be valid if you are contracted for a certain amount, but then paid a less amount than you were told you would be paid, their only response was, that's less than the minimum wage. No, the main idea behind that was that if you are promised something and you are given something else, the consent you gave on the basis of that promise is not valid. It's not informed consent. It isn't even in your self-interest, on their own criteria. The fact was, they never failed to untangle knowledge and rationality. That's why they lose this debate. Two main questions in this debate. The first is on consent, and the second is on better representation. First, on consent. They conceded that consent requires self-interest, and the question was then, which is more important to represent your self-interest, knowledge or rationality? We told you exactly why knowledge is important, because of the fact that so many things affect your life. Not just the farm subsidy they wanted to talk about, but the education your child gets, like the healthcare they receive if they go to the government hospital. Those are the kind of things we said are important to represent your own agency, your own self-interest. All they had to say to you was rationality. When we tried to use that buzzword, we told them rationality can only exist when you are aware of the outcomes. It's unclear as to how there can be some sort of rationality in deciding a contract, in deciding a vote, if you don't actually know what the outcomes of that vote are. They never had any responses, not even in their reply where they tried to make rebuttal. So clearly, we have to win this debate. What we pointed out is that information doesn't exist on their side. When we pointed out that the only thing they had to say was, why don't you have more voting power to people who are more informed? This completely failed to recognize that the criteria was set was a basic threshold of information. There is no real distinction between more informed and less informed. If there was, we never got to hear it from them, and so it can't be part of this debate. Next, we pointed out to you that informed consent is needed for a contract to be valid. Again, no response. Furthermore, they tried to muddy this by pointing out that information is going to be technocratic or technical. This is really bizarre, given that you don't need to understand monetary policy, for example, in order to understand microfinance and how it impacts your life. The distinction between macroeconomic and microeconomic, how it affects your life, was made completely unclear by their policy, when in reality it isn't, and it can be helped on our side. The fact is, they conceded, and this leads me to my second clash, they conceded that releasing knowledge is good. Why does this matter? Because on the second clash of better representation, they pointed out that they said you will suppress discourse when this happens. And then they later conceded that spreading information is good, because if you want to spread information, then surely you don't think that information is going to be biased or ideologically controlled, right? Basically, it contradicts their entire premise that there's going to be some sort of control over what people think. They basically have no idea on what better representation entails, and simply think it means less information and more self-interest on the basis of lies. What we told you at our deputy was really important, because poor people are going to be emancipated when you give them more information, when you create swing votes, when politicians have to engage with them on the things that they care about. The only thing they had to say to this was that people are not going to vote. We pointed out to you that it still creates better outcomes, better representation of what the poor need, what the poor want. It better represents people, it better fulfills the principles of democracy. We win.